So today we'll be discussing about McRae and Costa's the five-factor model. This is another trait personality theory, and we will see how it differs from Cattle's trait theory that we discussed in our previous meeting. So just as a refresher, you know, to remind us why are we studying about this, like about the personality. So suppose you meet a person for the first time in a very important meeting, and you notice that this person looks really neat, dresses well, very polite, and even his or her talk is really organized. You also realize that this person takes notes by hand. His or her handwriting looks really neat and arranged in a certain way. However, you also notice that whenever someone approaches this person, he or she looks uneasy and does not talk a lot to the other person. So you might be wondering whether this person actually always behaves that way in all situations, in every situation. Is it his characteristic, his or her characteristic? It is due to his or her personality, or it's just the situation, just because a very important meeting, or because it's the first meeting that the person attends, that he or she uh, wanted to look very organized, um, but at the same time feeling anxious about meeting new people. So this kind of experience might happen in our life, and it actually happens a lot, yeah, in our life, right? So every day we observe other people's behavior and we try to interpret the meaning behind each behavior. Yeah. Often we try to conclude whether someone's behavior actually represents his or her personality, or if it's only due to a certain situation. So we basically always try to understand whether someone's behavior is part of the personality. Is it something that it's always there, or it's just or is it very contextual or based on the situation, and the person will behave differently, totally differently in another situation. And we also tend to ask whether a certain personality, even, is it something that's stable, that not changing, or that doesn't change over time? Is it innate? Is it based on biological factors, or is it more due to environmental and influence? In the previous discussions, we have discussed about the nature versus nurture influence, and we already learned about what Cattle uh, thought about the nature and nurture experience, influence, sorry, nature and nurture influences. And we already learned that based on uh, Cattle's proposition, both nature and nurture played significant roles in people's personality, but depends on which trait. Yeah, which in one trait, nature maybe plays more role than nurture. Another trait, nurture might play more significant roles in shaping people's personality than the nature. Um, However, it's always a question about how to actually measure personality. Is it by standardized tests like the 16BF, and the other one that we are going to talk about today, the NEO-PI, that measures the five-factor personality, or is it by clinical observation? That we have to observe people's behavior in certain settings, how they behave in certain situations, or should we ask their friends, their family members, their relatives, their acquaintance? Um, so it's always, it's still a big question until now, like which one is the most efficient um, measure to actually understand people's personality. Well, we learned last time that Carol used basically, um, all of them. Yeah, but we will see that other theories approach these questions differently, and including McRae and Costa, they are using they were using a particular measure to understand people's personality. And another big question about personality is that, okay, if it's really traits, like okay, people have certain characteristics that we can call personality traits. So how many traits or personality factors does a person has? Is it something that's universal? Is it 35, as Carol said, or the 16 that is most commonly used from Carroll's theory? Or is it 4,000 or even 18,000 from what Albert initially found in the dictionary? Or is it three, as Hans Eysenck uh, proposed? Um, so there are so many questions, and even though many scholars have sort of uh, agreed on a particular number, and including the five-factor model has been used widely to measure people's personality across the world. This debate is still not settled. Yeah, there are still some other scholars who disagree. Some scholars say that it depends on the culture, and some other people, even another scholar actually also proposed a six-factor model instead of five. So even until now, yeah, even though these questions has been studied uh, in decades, but even until now, the debate is still not settled. But anyways, let's start talking about the McCrae and Costa's theory, the five-factor model, by starting with uh, the theories biographies. Okay, the first theorist of the five-factor model is Robert McCrae. He was born on April 28, 1949 in Maryville, Missouri in the United States. Since he was young, he had a very high interest in science and math, and he decided to study philosophy in undergraduate at the Michigan State University with a scholarship. But after he graduated, he was unsatisfied with the open-ended questions and non-empirical nature of the study of philosophy. So he decided to pursue a graduate study in psychology. So in Boston University. So during his PhD training, in his first year, he was sent to work as a research assistant with someone called James Fozard, who is also working at the Veterans Administration for the outpatient clinics in Boston. And then this person actually referred him to work with Paul Costa, and so after he finished his PhD, he directly worked with Paul Costa in a research project after completing his PhD. So he worked with him for 2 years, and then they both were hired to work in the National Institute on Aging's Gerontology Research Center. And this research center has a big database about on adult, developments. So from there, they use this data to first study about personality, and together with Costa, Robert McCrae worked on analyzing personality structure for over 40 years. Um, they they worked on developing the five-factor model in the 80s, and then they started to expand their research in many settings and cultures to see how consistent and stable is this five-factor personality traits across cultures. And then about Paul T. Costa, he was born on September 16, 1942 in Franklin, New Hampshire, also in the US. And then he graduated with a Bachelor of Psychology from Clark University in 1964, and then continued to pursue a degree in master's and PhD degree in psychology from the University of Chicago. And after he finished his PhD, he taught in Harvard for 2 years and then moved to the University of Massachusetts, Boston from 1973 to 1978. And this is where um, uh, McCrae basically met Costa, or Costa met McCrae. Basically, yeah, this is where McCrae started to work with Costa. And then they were both hired, were hired to work at the National Institute of Aging's Gerontology Research Center. And Costa himself was considered an important scholar in personality psychology. So he held some important positions in the APA, the American Psychological Association, especially the division that is relevant to the study of personality. And he was also president of the International Society for the Study of Individual Differences in 1995. So McCrae and Costa, because they worked for 4 decades together, more than 4 decades together, they um, published over 200 co-authored research articles and chapters in several books, including The Emerging Lives Enduring Disposition, Personality in Adulthood, a five-factor theory perspective, and then also developed the inventory, the revised neo-personality inventory. Um, how did they actually develop this personality theory? Because at that time, uh, during McCrae's PhD, um, and at the time, of course, Costa was already a faculty member uh, at Harvard. Yeah, there was during the 60s and 70s, there was a scholar, Walter Mischel. He was questioning about the nature of personality, because many scholars at that time believed that personality, there was no such thing called personality. It's personality is just uh, you know the way we respond to a certain situation, and there's nothing that's is personality. There's nothing called a stable personality. And so Michelle was kind of uh, questioning about that, and McCrae was sort of thinking about that it's impossible, that there's nothing that's stable across our lifetime. There should be something, that personality, uh, in someone's personality, there should be something that's stable. So it's not that it's always changing over time. And Costa was already having this interest in individual differences and personality when he was in uh, University of Chicago. Yeah, so it kind of matched, between both uh, these two people's interests. So that's why when they started working together at the uh, National Institute on this um, that research center on aging, they they used the data and started also collecting data themselves to study the structure of personality. Okay, let's start our discussion about the five-factor model theory by um, contrasting between Cattell's and McRae and Costa's trait theories. So first, Cattell used the inductive method of gathering data, which means that he did not have any preconceived bias. If you remember that, he did not have any preconceived bias about the number or even the name of the traits. He just let the data showed him, how many traits and what were the names of the traits. And the same with McRae and Costa. They also use the inductive method. They use the big data from the institute where they work, there's a center where they worked at that time, and also the data that they collected, used factor analysis, the same as Cattell. And then from there, they found that five factors. And then the second thing is the type of observation. The Cattle used three types of observation: L data, which is the live data, basically from the observation. Q data is from the questionnaire, including the 16 personality factor, and then the T data is the other objective tests, and he also includes some projective tests like the TAT and Rorschach test as objective tests of personality because of the resistance to faking, according to Cattle. But McRae and Costa only used the self-report questionnaire, so they only used questionnaires. They didn't use observations. They didn't use clinical observations. They didn't use biography or life data or projective measures. Only self-report questionnaires. And then the third is that Cattle divided traits into several types of classifications. If you remember, the common versus the unique traits, and then the surface and the source traits, and then the ability and temperamental and dynamic traits. But McRae and Costa did not divide traits this way. They believe in just that 5-factor, but we will see how I will discuss about how this the traits are influenced by other factors. And then Cattle's approach yielded 35 primary or first order traits, so basically 35 primary traits that consisted of the 23 of the normal traits and the 12 pathological traits, and the 16 PF, the 16 personality factors, is the most frequently used in measuring personality that is based on Cattle's theory. McRae and Costa, they believed in only five, five and only five personality factors. So not it's not fewer than that and not more than that. Yeah, so just five and only five personality factors. But actually, McRae and Costa did not find the five factors directly. So in the late 1970s and early 80s, they built elaborate taxonomies of personality traits using factor analysis to examine the stability and structure of personality. At that time, they were only focusing on two main dimensions that were the neuroticism and extraversion. So they believed in this only two factor, but then they discovered once they found these two, by using more data to with the factor analysis, they found the third factor, that was the openness to experience. And so in the beginning, their 5-factor theory was actually a 3-factor model. So it was only the neuroticism, extraversion, and openness to experience. And that's why in 1983, they developed a personality inventory based on the 3-factor model, and that's why it was named the NEO-PI. NEO-PI. So the neuroticism, extraversion, and openness to experience personality inventory. But it wasn't unpublished. It wasn't published because afterward they found two other factors, which were the agreeableness and conscientiousness. So in 1985, they published a the revised NEO-PI. So the revised 5-factor personality inventory. So it's called the revised NEO-PI. So what are the 5 factors in McRae and Costa's 5-factor theory? So first is neuroticism, right? Neuroticism describes as someone who is high, who score high in neuroticism. The person will be anxious, insecure, nervous, and highly strung. And then the second factor is extroversion. The description is someone who score high here. They will seem to be sociable, talkative, fun-loving, and affectionate. And then the third factor is the openness to experience. The person who score high here will seem to be original, Be seen to be original, independent, creative, and daring. Uh, and then the fourth factor, the agreeableness. A person who score high here look uh, would be considered good-natured, soft-hearted, trusting, and courteous. Um, while the fifth factor, the conscientiousness, uh, would show us if someone is careful, reliable, hardworking, and organized. So these five factors here in this slide is ordered based on um, the chronological, the history, based on the chronological uh, history, like from the first two factors, neuroticism and extraversion, and then the third factor is openness, yeah, the one that they found, and then the fourth and the fifth factors that they found later on were the agreeableness and conscientiousness. But if you want to um, remember these five factors easier, you can use the abbreviation OCEAN, yeah, the OCEAN, yeah, O for openness, and C for conscientiousness, and E for extraversion, A for the agreeableness, and N for the neuroticism. So this is just a brief description about the personality test instrument. It's called, as I have already mentioned many times, it's called the Neo Personality Inventory. The name uses the acronym of the first three factors. Um, and then the results of the study indicate that factors can be relied upon as distinguishing aspects of personality. So it really shows that that we can differentiate people based on these five factors only. So whether someone is very agreeable or not, or whether someone is very conscientious. If one person is really conscientious, the other person is not conscientious at all, or moderate, or in terms of conscientiousness, for example, or someone is really open to experience, the other person is not. Someone is really uh, anxious about something, someone is really relaxed. So we can differentiate or distinguish people's characteristics based on these five factors. There are various versions of measuring instruments, but NEO, this one, the NEO Personality Inventory, is the most widely used at the current time. But it should also be noted that the results of the NEO measurements can be distorted by deliberately giving responses that show a positive psychological adjustment. Yeah, because, okay, if we ask someone about, for example, in the neuroticism factor, maybe people want to look not as anxious as they actually are. They want to look more relaxed. And for the openness of to experience, they might want to show that they are more adventurous, they are more open-minded, like something like that, instead of the narrow-minded and um, not adventurous, the close-minded. So there are still, something that might uh, distort the result of this personality measure, but this is still the most widely used at the current time.